All right, so are humans good or bad?
Hmm.
I mean, it's a question that's been around forever.
Yeah, pretty much as long as we've been thinking about ourselves.
Exactly. And, our listeners are really interested in this, and they sent in some fascinating material.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, all about Rutger Bregman's book,
Rutger Bregman.
Humankind, A Hopeful History. Have you heard of this one?
Vaguely, yeah.
Okay, so we've got like excerpts from the book summary. We took a peek at the Wikipedia page, and we even found a YouTube interview
Oh, wow.
with Bregman himself.
That's cool.
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, we've got a review from Nonviolence News giving us their take on the whole thing.
Okay, lots to unpack then.
It is. It's like we're looking at one book through a kaleidoscope.
I like that.
So let's dive in and see what we can uncover about human nature.
All right, let's do it.
Now, one thing that really struck me was how Bregman challenges that deep-seated belief that we're all just kind of
Oh, yeah.
selfish and bad deep down.
The veneer theory.
Yeah, the veneer theory. Like civilization is just this thin layer covering our true savage nature.
Right, and he really goes after that idea pretty hard.
Yeah, it's like we're all just one bad day away from turning into, like Lord of the Flies.
Exactly. But Bregman argues that this view is not only pessimistic, but it's actually inaccurate.
Okay, so where is he going with this? What evidence does he have?
Well, he starts by looking at how people behave in crises,
Okay.
like the bombings during World War II, Hurricane Katrina, even the sinking of the Titanic.
But what? People don't panic. They don't turn on each other.
It's actually the opposite. He finds that people often band together and help each other out during these tough times.
Huh. So all those disaster movies we watch, are they giving us like a totally wrong idea about how people actually behave?
It's a good question. He talks about something called the nocebo effect. Have you heard of this?
No.
It's like where our cynical expectations can actually lead to more negative behavior.
Yeah.
Like if we expect the worst from people, we might actually create that reality.
Oh, that makes sense, like a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing.
That's exactly it.
So if we assume everyone's going to loot and riot after a hurricane, then we're more likely to do it ourselves or at least interpret other people's actions that way.
Precisely. And he points out that the media often plays a role in this by focusing on the sensational and the negative.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So it's those images and stories that stick in our minds, even if they don't represent the full picture.
Well, this makes me think about Lord of the Flies. You know that book?
Oh, yeah.
It's always held up as like proof that left to our own devices will just, descend into chaos.
It's a classic.
But Bregman, he actually found a real-life Lord of the Flies situation.
He did.
Yeah, with a completely different outcome.
Okay, I've got to hear about this. What happened?
Okay, so it's the story of these 6 Tongan schoolboys
Okay.
who ended up stranded on a deserted island, get this, for 15 months.
Oh, wow.
And guess what? They cooperated. They created their own little society. They even healed a broken leg with just basic first aid.
Really? So much for survival of the fittest.
I know. Bregman actually suggests survival of the friendliest might be more accurate.
Survival of the friendliest. I love that.
Yeah, right. It makes you wonder, how did we evolve to be so good at cooperation?
Well, he dives into some research on domesticated animals. Have you ever heard of the Russian silver fox experiment?
No. Tell me more.
So they bred these foxes for friendliness over generations.
For friendliness?
Yeah. And as they did that, they started to see changes in their physical features, too.
Like what kind of changes?
Smaller teeth, floppy ears, even more youthful-looking faces.
Wait, are you saying humans are just like friendly foxes that we bred ourselves for cuteness?
Well, Bregman draws some interesting parallels. He points out that compared to our early ancestors, we have some of their same features.
Like smaller teeth?
Yeah, less pronounced features. And he links that to our development of social intelligence.
So being friendly actually made us smarter.
Well, Bregman highlights the work of Brian Hare, who studies canine intelligence.
Okay.
And Hare argues that domesticated dogs and foxes aren't less intelligent. They're just differently intelligent. They're better at reading social cues and learning from humans.
Which has been a huge advantage for us, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We traded brute strength for social smarts, and that allowed us to thrive.
Okay, I'm following you, but I'm also thinking about all the violence and conflict in the world.
Right.
How does Bregman deal with that? How does that fit into this whole humans are good idea?
He doesn't shy away from it at all. He acknowledges that violence exists, but he challenges this idea that it's our default setting.
Okay, I see.
He even presents research showing that most soldiers in World War II and Vietnam didn't actually fire their weapons.
Really?
That's surprising.
It is. He explains that taking another human life, especially up close, is incredibly difficult psychologically. We're wired for empathy. It goes against our basic instincts to see another person as just, the enemy that has to be eliminated.
Yeah.
So war is almost like forcing people to act against their nature.
It's like we're overriding something deep within us. He also talks about how war and terrorism often exploit our need for belonging and camaraderie.
So they're twisting our good instincts, our need to connect, and using them for destructive purposes.
Exactly. Which is why he thinks we need to rethink some of those classic studies that have been used to demonstrate human cruelty.
Oh, you mean like the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram shock machine?
Yeah, those are the ones.
Yeah, those always seem pretty bleak to me.
They did, right. But Bregman argues that those studies have been widely misinterpreted.
Really? How so?
Well, take the Stanford Prison Experiment, for example.
Right.
The researchers actually told the guards to act harshly, and some participants even resisted those instructions.
So it wasn't just a case of good people turning bad. The situation was kind of rigged from the start.
That's his argument.
And what about the Milgram experiment? The one with the electric shocks?
Right. Well, in that one, many participants continued because they thought the research was important.
So they were trying to be helpful, not blindly obedient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bregman suggests they were more concerned with being good participants than being good people.
Okay, so we got these classic studies that maybe don't paint the full picture.
Right.
What about Easter Island? The cautionary tale of a civilization that destroyed itself because of greed.
Yes, a classic.
Bregman actually calls that a fabrication.
Wait, a fabrication? What do you mean?
He says the story we've been told about Easter Island is just wrong.
Oh, really? I'm intrigued.
He points to newer research that suggests the island's population didn't actually collapse the way we thought.
Interesting.
The deforestation might have been caused by rats,
Right.
not overharvesting by the islanders. And he also highlights the impact of European contact with its diseases and violence. Things we often overlook.
So the whole Easter Island proves humans are bad
Yeah.
argument. Maybe that's just not accurate.
That's what Bregman suggests, yeah.
Fascinating. So he's really pushing us to question these deeply ingrained narratives.
He is. He's basically saying that our assumptions about human nature can actually distort how we interpret history.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. So if we're constantly looking for evidence of human failure, we're probably going to find it.
Right, even if it means twisting the facts to fit our preconceived notions.
Exactly.
Which leads to a bigger question that Bregman explores.
Well,
Can the way we structure our societies actually make us bad, even if we're not inherently so?
Oh, that's a big one. I'm guessing he thinks the answer is yes.
He does look at hunter-gatherer societies that were egalitarian and peaceful.
Okay.
And he suggests that many of our problems today, things like war, inequality, violence, they might stem from how we shifted to agriculture and settled communities, which ultimately led to hierarchies and power imbalances.
So it's not just about who we are as individuals, but how we organize ourselves as a society.
That's a big part of his argument, yeah.
And on top of all of this research and these historical examples, Bregman also offers some practical advice, like those 10 rules for living in a more hopeful world.
Right. I was just reading about those in the Nonviolence News Review. I think one of them was, when in doubt, assume the best.
Don't punch Nazis was another one.
Yeah.
Some really thought-provoking stuff in there.
Yeah, he's definitely pushing us to rethink a lot of things about human nature and how we relate to each other.
He is. And I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already.
We have, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to delve even deeper into Bregman's ideas and explore some of those 10 rules for a better world in our next segment.
Can't wait.
Stay tuned, folks. Things are about to get really interesting.
So before the break, we were talking about Bregman's pretty radical ideas about human nature.
Yeah, homo puppy and all that.
Right, exactly. But the big question is, so what? Like, how do we actually apply these ideas in the real world?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Like, it's one thing to say humans are inherently good, but how does that actually help us deal with all the messed up stuff happening in the world?
Yeah.
Climate change, poverty, all the conflict.
Right. It can't just be wishful thinking. Bregman actually offers some concrete examples of how these ideas can play out in different systems.
Okay, like what?
Well, he talks about prisons, for example. specifically a prison in Norway.
What, those ones where the prisoners have, like, their own apartments and stuff?
That's the one.
Yeah, that sounds pretty utopian to me.
It does, right. But it's a real place. And get this, they have amazingly low recidivism rates.
So the prisoners are less likely to reoffend once they're released.
Way less likely. And the idea is that by treating prisoners with dignity and respect,
Okay.
you actually encourage them to become more responsible citizens. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a good way.
So instead of assuming the worst about people and locking them up in cages, you create an environment that actually supports their rehabilitation.
Exactly. And this approach isn't limited to prisons. Bregman talks about schools that have gotten rid of grades and homework.
Really? No grades?
Yep, no grades. And businesses that operate with total transparency and shared decision-making. He even mentions a city in Venezuela that experimented with a form of direct democracy.
Direct democracy. So, like, the citizens had a direct say in how their tax dollars were spent.
That's the idea. Now, these are just a few examples, and they're not without their challenges.
Right. They sound pretty radical.
They are radical. But they offer a glimpse of what might be possible if we rethink some of our basic assumptions about human nature.
Okay, so let's say we buy into this idea that humans are basically good. What then? Like, what do we do with that information?
Well, that's where those 10 rules for a better world come in.
Okay, the ones we talked about before the break.
Right. And they might seem simple on the surface.
Yeah, like, when in doubt, assume the best and don't punch Nazis.
Right. But they actually require a pretty fundamental shift in how we think and act.
I mean, can we really live by these rules in the real world? With all the, negativity and stuff.
It's a challenge, for sure. But Bregman is arguing that it's a challenge worth taking on.
Okay, but how do we even begin to make that shift?
Well, one thing he talks about is the importance of being aware of the stories we're constantly being fed, especially by the media. All that negativity.
Yeah, it's like if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. And Bregman actually compares our consumption of news to an addiction.
Oh, wow, an addiction. That's a little scary.
It is scary, and it's hard to break free from that cycle of negativity. But he suggests we can start by being more mindful of what we're consuming.
Okay, so like limiting our exposure to the news.
It's not about completely avoiding the news. It's more about being conscious of the sources we choose.
Okay.
And making sure we're also seeking out stories that inspire us, stories that highlight human goodness and resilience, stories that remind us of the good in the world.
I like that. So it's not about ignoring the bad stuff, but balancing it out with the good.
That's it. And then there's the whole question of how we treat each other.
Oh, right, like in our daily interactions.
Exactly. Are we approaching conversations with curiosity and empathy? Or are we just jumping to conclusions and judgments?
So like really trying to listen and understand where the other person is coming from.
Exactly.
Even if we disagree with them.
Even if we disagree, it's about recognizing their humanity.
Which can be really hard sometimes.
It can be really hard, especially in our current climate. But Bregman argues that this is where real change begins, in those small, everyday interactions.
So it's not just about these grand utopian visions of like prison reform and direct democracy.
Yeah.
It's also about how we treat the barista at the coffee shop or the person we disagree with on social media.
It all adds up. Every interaction is an opportunity to practice kindness, compassion, and understanding.
Okay, I'm getting this.
Yeah.
But there's still this nagging question in the back of my mind. What about personal responsibility? Like, where does that fit in with all of this?
That's a great question, and it's one that Bregman addresses directly. He acknowledges that individual actions matter,
Okay.
but he also emphasizes the importance of understanding the context in which those actions take place. So it's not about letting individuals off the hook for their behavior.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that our actions are shaped by the systems we're a part of.
So it's a both-hand situation. Like, we can hold people accountable for their choices while also working to create systems that encourage positive behavior.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, because if we believe that people are fundamentally good, then maybe the problem isn't so much with individuals as it is with the systems that are corrupting them.
I see what you're saying. Like, if we create systems that reward greed and selfishness, then we shouldn't be surprised when people act that way.
Precisely. And Bregman's whole point is that we can create different systems, systems that nurture our better angels.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we actually go about changing these systems? It all seems so, like, big and overwhelming.
It is a daunting task, but Bregman reminds us that these systems weren't created overnight, and they won't change overnight either. It's an ongoing process. And it starts with recognizing the power of the stories we tell ourselves.
Oh, right, like the story we tell ourselves about human nature.
Exactly. If we believe that people are inherently selfish and greedy, then we're going to create systems that reflect that belief. But if we choose to believe in the good in people,
Then we can start to build systems that nurture that goodness.
right, systems that promote cooperation, compassion, and a sense of shared responsibility.
Okay, so it's about shifting the narrative, about challenging those old stories that tell us humans are only capable of bad things.
Exactly. And that's where those 10 rules can be so helpful. They offer practical guidance for how to live in a way that reflects that new story, a story of hope and possibility.
So it's not just about changing the systems, it's about changing ourselves too.
It's both. It's about recognizing that we're all part of these systems and that we have the power to change them both from the inside out and the outside in. And that's a pretty empowering thought.
It is empowering.
Mm.
It gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, we can actually create a better world.
Me too. But hope isn't enough. We have to act on that hope. We have to choose to believe in the good in humanity and then act accordingly in our everyday lives, in our interactions with others, and in the systems we participate in.
So what you're saying is that creating a better world starts with each of us.
Absolutely. It starts with believing in the possibility of something better and then choosing to act on that belief.
Wow, this has been a really intense conversation. I'm feeling a lot of things right now, hopeful, inspired, maybe a little overwhelmed.
It's a lot to process, but I think it's important to sit with these ideas, to really grapple with them and see how they resonate with you. What are you taking away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we have more power than we realize. The power to choose the stories we believe, the power to shape the systems we're a part of, and the power to create a better world. It's not going to be easy,
Definitely not.
but it's possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's something worth fighting for.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And we'll continue this conversation in our next segment where we'll dive even deeper into Bregman's 10 rules for a better world.
Can't wait. So stay tuned, folks, because this is just the beginning. So much to think about. I mean, where do we even begin if we want to, actually live by these rules, these 10 rules for a better world? It can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, is it even possible to be this optimistic, this hopeful, when the world seems so full of negativity?
Yeah, it's a real challenge for sure. But Bregman really stresses the importance of questioning the stories we've been told, the ones that feed into that negativity, the ones that make us feel like, oh, humans are just bad, it's hopeless.
Right, like that whole veneer theory we were talking about before.
Exactly. He's saying, don't just accept those stories at face value. Dig a little deeper, look for alternative perspectives,
So it's about being critical, right? Like not just blindly believing everything we hear or read, especially in the news.
Exactly. And remember, the media loves to focus on the negative, the sensational. It's how they get our attention. But it's not the whole story.
No, it's definitely not. I mean, I know I've caught myself getting sucked into that negativity spiral, especially when I'm scrolling through the news online.
It happens to all of us. It's like Bregman says, it can become an addiction, this constant exposure to negativity. And it can really warp our view of the world. So what can we do about it?
That's the big question, right?
Well, we can start by being more intentional about the information we consume. Like, are we choosing sources that are reliable and balanced? Are we making sure to get a variety of perspectives?
It's not about avoiding the news altogether. It's about being more selective about what we consume and from where.
Exactly. And it's also about making sure we're balancing out the negative with some positive, seeking out stories that inspire us, that remind us of the good in the world.
I think that's so important, like actively looking for the good instead of just letting the bad stuff dominate our attention. But it's more than just, changing what we read or watch.
Right. It's also about what we share with others. What stories are we amplifying with our own voices? Are we contributing to the negativity, or are we helping to shift the narrative in a more hopeful direction?
So it's not just about being a critical consumer of information. It's also about being a responsible creator and sharer of information.
Exactly. We can all play a role in shaping the story of humanity, and that's a pretty empowering thought. But it doesn't stop there.
What else is there?
Well, think about how we interact with each other, even in those small, everyday moments. Are we approaching people with kindness and curiosity? Or are we quick to judge and dismiss?
Oh, yeah, like that saying, assume positive intent. It's easy to jump to conclusions, especially online.
It is. But what if we made a conscious effort to give people the benefit of the doubt, to see the good in them, even when it's hard.
That's a tough one, but I can see how it would make a huge difference. It's like choosing to see the homo puppy in everyone, even when they're not acting very puppy-like.
Exactly, and that's where Bregman's 10 rules really come into play. They give us a framework for how to live in a way that aligns with this more hopeful, more compassionate view of human nature.
And the amazing thing is, it's not just about changing ourselves. It's also about changing the systems we're a part of. Like you said, we have more power than we realize.
We do. We can challenge unjust systems, we can advocate for policies that promote equality and well-being, and we can support organizations that are working to make the world a better place. And all of those actions send a message. They tell a different story about who we are and what we're capable of.
So it's like a ripple effect. Our individual actions can create waves of change that spread outward, impacting our communities and ultimately the world.
Exactly, and that's why I think Bregman's message is so important, so timely. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming challenges, we have a choice. We can choose to succumb to cynicism and despair, or we can choose to embrace hope and possibility. We can choose to believe in a better future and then work together to create it.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's one that we all need to hear, especially right now.
I agree. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The story of humanity is still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping how that story unfolds.
So, what will your contribution be? How will you choose to write your chapter in the story of Homo Puppy?
That's a question for each of us to answer, but I have a feeling that if we choose to embrace hope, compassion, and a belief in our shared humanity, the ending will be pretty amazing.
I love that. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey of exploring human nature.
It's been my pleasure, and to everyone listening, thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Remember, keep those brains buzzing and keep believing in the good. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.